All right. Well, we spent most of last year talking about nouns. My ADD does not permit me to go further on that topic. So we are moving on. I guess this could qualify as a noun. I want to talk about Timothy, and not our beloved and esteemed worship leader Timothy, but Timothy of yore. How's that sound? So Timothy. Right. Now, hopefully at some point in your Christian life, in everybody's Christian life, a believer realizes how much God has done for them through Christ. You get saved, you begin growing, and it suddenly dawns on you at one point or another, probably it more like evolves and just pounds on you like a wave crashing on the shore, that eventually you realize, wow, God has done a lot for me. That sending Jesus to die on the cross in my place for my sins, was huge, and you begin to realize how much you kind of owe him as a result. And so you reach that moment. And as you recognize how much God has done for you, that realization kind of births within you a desire to do something for him. It's not something that everybody lives with every day, but hopefully at some point or another in every believer's life, there'll come that moment where there's a recognition, and it's coupled with this desire, I want to do something for God because of what he's done for me. And the more seriously we take what he has done, Matt, I'm going to still need you up the drive in there, brother. So the more we realize how significant that was, and the more meaningful it is to us, the stronger our desire to do something significant and meaningful for him. Hopefully at some point you will get that, or have had that, a desire to do something that's really significant for Christ. Now, here's the thing though, as you look around church, as you look around people you know, as you look around life, some of you have grown up in church. I've been in church since I was 6 years old. As I reflect upon my own experience, though I think every believer has this desire hit them at one point or another in their journey, what is clear is there aren't a lot of believers who do significant things for Christ. It just does. It should be normal, but it's not. It should be the universal expression of believers everywhere to say, God did something amazing for me. I want to do something amazing for him. Now, and I don't define amazing as necessarily big or necessarily make you wide known, because there's only so much of that can go around. But something that is a real and significant work for Christ, there aren't a lot of believers who actually accomplish something significant for Christ, at least not in proportion to the number of believers there are. And so you get this disparity between this desire to do something significant and this seemingly non-accomplishment of something significant. And the question that comes to my mind is why? Why, if every believer desires at some point in their relationship with God to do something significant for God, why don't they? What stops them from doing something significant? And for you and I, that's probably the bigger question, because if you haven't had that desire hit you yet, my prayer is that you do at some point, and when you hit that desire, I want you to know what it is that might stand in your way so that it doesn't. Now, fortunately, in Timothy, we actually see a fairly young man who accomplishes much for God over a very long time of life. He does, from a very young age, starts to accomplish very significant things for Christ. And it's important to keep in mind Timothy was a relatively young man. We don't know expressly how old he was, but he was old enough that Paul, in several places, had to say, don't let people pick on you because you're young. Now that could mean anything. When I first started as the pastor here, every meeting I went to, I was the youngest person in the room. That was just my norm. I was so thankful when we started to get a couple folks who are younger than I am, because then at least I'm not the youngest person in the room. So Timothy could have been that. I think Timothy was probably, as he started with Paul, was probably in his teenage years. And that seems quite likely. So from a very young age, he accomplished something significant, and he continued to accomplish significant works for Christ over a very long period of time. And so he becomes very instructive for us. I want to accomplish something great for God. What do I need to do? What stands in my way? What am I lacking that's enabling me to get there? And we see the answer in Timothy. And so I'd invite your attention to Acts chapter 16 is where I'm going to basically camp. I'm going to back up a couple verses and take a running start at this. Acts chapter 15 and verse 40, Paul is getting ready to begin his second missionary journey. Missionary journey just being he was leaving from the church at Antioch, and he was going to go around to many of the churches that he'd gone to before throughout the area of Asia Minor and heading over toward Greece. And we'll throw the map up on there for just a second as soon as we read this. And so we find in Acts chapter 15, verses 40 and 41, Paul chose Silas and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God, and he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So if we can have that map back, Matt. So on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, now this map is skewed from what you might have seen, but up in the top right-hand corner there is the city of Antioch, and that's where Paul was leaving from. And from there, he heads to these cities that are mentioned here for us, and through Syria and Cilicia. So he's going to these different regions, and he's beginning this journey. And this journey is going to take him, as you see here, throughout much of the region of Greece and Asia, and he's going through. And very early on is where we find ourselves in Acts chapter 16. He's pretty early in this missionary journey, and he runs into a city called Derbe. And so we find ourselves, Acts chapter 16 and verse 1. He'll get there. There we go. Then he came to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but his father was a Greek. And so very early in this process, he runs into these two cities, and he runs into this guy, this young man named Timothy. Now, there's a couple things that we're told here. First of all, we find that his father is a Greek, and his mother is Jewish. And so he's already got somewhat of a mixed heritage. His father was Greek, and so he was being brought up in some primarily Greek customs, and we can kind of see that as we go forward. But his mother, we're told, was Jewish, and she was a believer. And what we'll find later on in the other books of Timothy is that not only was his mother a Jewish believer, but his grandmother was a Jewish believer as well. And so what you end up here with in Timothy is somebody who is a third-generation Christian, which is a bit of an oxymoron because God doesn't have grandchildren. And so really he's just the third in line of first-generation Christians because every generation must be new itself. One of the things that I grew up with and kind of struggled with as a kid, and many of you guys who are kids here today are going to struggle with as you get older, is in being a second or third generation Christian or even further back, you grew up in church for so long that your testimony is so vanilla that it has like nothing. Like God didn't have to like launch a nuclear attack at you to get your attention, to bring you to faith in Christ and to motivate you to serve Him. And so in the nature of growing up in church, growing up knowing Christ from a young age, sometimes we struggle with that idea of, well, how am I going to have a great testimony? How am I going to be passionate? God didn't deliver me from a lot. And the reality is, as we begin to think about our life, what it was, what it is, and what it could have been, and we can begin to see how much He actually did deliver us from. So that's overcomable. But in Timothy, we find somebody who is very sympathetic to that idea because he came from a family who, by and large, believed. Now, we don't know if his father was a believer or not. We don't get that kind of hint from what we're told here. It doesn't seem like he probably was, but he could have been. But here we find in Timothy a young man who had actually impressed quite a few people. Look in Acts 16, verse 2. He was well spoken of by the brethren who were at Lystra and Iconium. And so here's a guy, despite the fact that he's a young man, has actually impressed believers in 2 different cities. There were several people who knew him in several churches, the people around. They looked at Timothy and said, this is an impressive young man. This is a young man who, despite his age, seems to have good things going for him. He was well reported of by the believers in those 2 areas. In verse 3, Paul wanted to have him go with him. And so not only did he impress the believers in these 2 other cities, but he impressed the Apostle Paul. Now, Paul was not the easiest guy on the planet to impress. Paul, somebody asked the question, Pastor, can you recite the whole Bible? The answer is no. Paul, on the other hand, could. That was part of his deal as being a Pharisee. Granted, it was only the first 5 books. The Pharisees were required to be able to say from memory, but you can imagine memorizing Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That is no mean feat. And so here's a guy who he was hardcore before hardcore was popular, kind of a guy. He was a guy who was out killing people because he thought it was a good work for God. Very zealous. He was very ambitious, very driven. Spoke a half a dozen languages. He was just really, in many ways, except for probably his physical appearance, larger than life. Not easy to impress, and yet Timothy impressed Paul to the place where here's Paul, having just met him as he's beginning this trip, goes, I want to take you with me. I think I can teach you something, and I think you can learn something, and I think you can be helpful and useful in this process. And Paul wasn't interested in having hangers-on. He didn't want people who were just there for the sake of being there. If you weren't contributing to the mission, you weren't coming to the mission. He wasn't going to foot your travel expenses for you to sit there and just be a tourist. And so Timothy really impressed him, but there was a bit of a snag in this process, and some of you read ahead and know this. Paul wanted him to go with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in the region, for they all knew that his father was Greek. Let me just start by saying, ow. Timothy, I want you to go with me to the mission, but you're going to have this operation, a little procedure. If you don't know what circumcise is, look it up. I'm not going there. Talk to your mom and dad about it. But the idea that you would take somebody who even is a young teenager and, to the guillotine and, wow. Yeah, moving on. I'm not sure how the conversation played out with them, but here's what I know. Here's what I do know. As you read through the text, there's not much attention given to this detail, although arguably it's a big detail. Ben, take that down, please. It is arguably a big detail, and yet there is not any attention. It's almost just kind of run over it far more rapidly than I stumbled over it. It just was not a big deal. It just happened. And so he went ahead and had this. Now, the reason behind this that we're given here is that there were a lot of people who knew Timothy, knew his father was a Greek, and for the Jewish population, this is a problem. It's a problem for them to have an uncircumcised person trying to communicate the scriptures to them. It's a real big deal, and yes, they did check. And so this is a problem for them. And Paul's desire, Paul's mission was to reach as many people as he could. He was ministering everywhere he went, primarily to Jewish people, and then that would expand to Gentile people as well. But in order for him to be able to effectively minister, that was just something that needed to happen. Now, Paul's philosophy on it was this, and it comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Paul said it this way, and it's a great verse. We talk about it and we break it all the time because we want to do this. But Paul said, to the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. That was Paul's mission. He wanted to reach as many people as he could possibly reach, and he was willing to do everything that was moral and legal to do to get it done. Whatever he had to do to identify with a group of people, he would do. If it wasn't illegal and it wasn't immoral, it was on the table. That was just how Paul approached his mission. He operated so far outside of his own comfort zone that it was ridiculous. And so he says to Timothy, I want you to join me on this mission. You're going to have this procedure. And Timothy, without batting an eye, went ahead and he did it. His commitment to the gospel was such that he was willing to undergo even this kind of procedure at this juncture in his life because it was that important to him for the sake of the gospel. And so we find, as we continue reading then, that they continue from this area and they go on into this missionary journey. And we get to verse 4. And as they went through the cities, they delivered to them the decrees to keep, which were determined by the apostles and elders at Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in faith and increased in number daily. And so we find right off the bat that Timothy's presence contributed to the overall success of this mission. That they go out, they're preaching, they're teaching. The churches that had been established on Paul's first missionary journey earlier on are more strengthened. The believers are built up and they're edified, they're strengthened and they're taught. And new people are getting saved and new churches are being planted as a result of this mission that Timothy is a part of. Now, as you look at that kind of success, what we would all say is that he was participating in a pretty significant work for Christ right from the very beginning. That right out of the gate, once he healed, there was a mission that he was on. It was significant. Churches were growing. Churches were starting. People were getting saved. People were getting baptized. People were being matured. And then they were being sent out to reach other people. It was significant right from the very beginning. And the lesson that we see in this small chapter in Timothy's life is simply this, and it is the point for tonight, is that significant accomplishments require significant commitment. Significant accomplishments require significant commitment. Timothy was committed to the gospel to the place that he was willing to undergo what was probably a painful procedure and recovery for the sake of the gospel. That's committed. Gentlemen, we agree? That's committed. And so when you reach that point where you realize God has done amazing things for me, I want to do something significant for him. The thing that stands in many people's way, and the reason they don't, is because though they have a great desire to do something significant for God, they don't have a great commitment to do something great for God. Significant accomplishments require significant commitment. So when you reach that point, the question you're going to have to ask yourself is, what am I willing to do? What am I willing to give? What am I willing maybe to give up? What am I willing to do without? What cost am I willing to pay to satisfy this desire I have to do something significant for Christ because he did something amazingly significant for me? That's the question you have to grapple with in that moment. I want to do something significant. I have to be significantly committed, though, before it's going to happen. Significant accomplishments require significant commitment.